Hey guys, it's Daphne, and today I wanted to do a video talking about what have been my favorite books so far in the year. Since we're a little over halfway through, I just want to talk about 10 books that so far are contenders to be my year-end favorites. I think when I'll be listing these off, these are actually going to be chronologically when I read them throughout the year. So the first book I wanted to talk about is The Unseen World by Liz Moore, and this follows a young girl named Ada Sibelius who is homeschooled. She's being raised by her brilliant but eccentric single father, David, who runs a computer science lab in 1980s Boston, but events come to surface that reveal that her father, David, is not exactly who he says he is. And the journey to figure out who he is will lead into her adulthood. I loved this book. Obviously it's on my favorites video that you're watching right now, but I thought it was gripping and emotional and just wonderfully written and had so many great layers. I don't know, I really connected to this one right away. This was like the first standout book I read in the year that just blew me away. The second book I wanted to talk about is My Cousin Rachel by Daphne DuMaurier. And this follows a man named Philip who was orphaned at a young age and raised by his older cousin Ambrose. Now Ambrose is taking a vacation in Italy to convalesce when he meets a distant relative of his named Rachel, and he uncharacteristically marries her. But what really raises red flags to Philip is the sudden death of his cousin Ambrose and some cryptic letters he sent concerning Rachel before his death. And Rachel shows up in England to meet with Philip and look at the estate, and the whole novel is just a question of like, who is this, you know, my cousin Rachel? Like, what is her deal? This book was great if you love stories where you kind of don't know how to take people. Like, are they evil? Are they good? There's kind of explanations for both sides. Like, is Philip falling for everything, or is she telling the truth? And what is going on? This was great. I absolutely recommend this. I also loved Rebecca by her, but I think I might like My Cousin Rachel more. Next on the list is Sleeping Giants by Sylvain Nouvel. I'm including this and Waking Gods in the trilogy. I'm just gonna count like this series on here, but this is a science fiction series that starts off when a young girl riding her bike falls into a ditch, and she wakes up on a giant metal hand, which they discover is made of metal that is not found anywhere on Earth. So years later, that young girl has become the leading physicist on a mission to recover the rest of the parts that go to this statue, and everything that ensues as they try to find the parts, and everyone involved in this mission, and everyone's relationship to each other, and the consequences of finding those parts and building this statue, and what that could mean for Earth and humanity. This book got me really interested in science fiction, and if you're gonna read this, I really recommend the audiobook. It's a full cast narration, and it is a performance, and I just absolutely loved this story. Next up is The Dry by Jane Harper. This is a thriller, the first one in what's going to be her Aaron Falk series. So this story starts off with Aaron Falk heading to his small town in Australia where he grew up to attend the funeral of his childhood friend and his family. Aaron Falk has a very complicated relationship with the small town and his residents because he and his father were run off the small town many years ago because they were blamed for the death of a teenage girl. At the funeral, his deceased friend's father approaches him and asks him if he would be willing to investigate the circumstances leading to his son and daughter-in-law and grandchildren's death. Aaron Falk tells him like, hey, this isn't really my deal, homicide. I'm in like finance crimes, white collar kind of stuff. But then his friend's father leans in and whispers, I know your alibi isn't true for the day that that girl died. And so he decides that his best course of action is to investigate what happened to his friend. And we also learn the events, of course, leading up to what ran him out of town. There's nothing I love more than like a lead character in a thriller mystery story investigating something that they are connected to in some way, whether they knew the person or have history with the place. And this was just done so well. The pacing was great, the writing was great. I can definitely see why Jane Harper gets compared to Ton of French quite a bit. I just think they hit the same beats very well. Next up on the list is The Last Days of Jack Sparks by Jason Arnopp. And this is a story of Jack Sparks, who is a very controversial British journalist known for getting very involved in his subject matter. He wrote a book on drugs and the drug world and had to check himself into rehab after releasing the story. He tells his followers that he is going to be writing a book centered around the occult. And the book that you are reading is his posthumous manuscript, because you know that Jack Sparks has died while working on his book about the occult. And while you're reading it, you're seeing his notes to the editor. I thought this was just horror that was done very well. There was the humor from Jack Sparks' snarkiness, but there definitely were some horrifying scene. Basically, what the chain of events that sets this off down a dark path is that Jack Sparks is witnessing a live exorcism at the Vatican, and he tweets a joke out to his followers and actually laughs during the exorcism, so that he may have garnered the attention of some not so great things that start following him. And then later there's a very mysterious 40-second YouTube video that's uploaded to his account, and he doesn't know how it got there, and then it just goes away. And so stuff starts going down. He becomes obsessed with what's happening to him and just everything that goes on with it. And in this story, you do get his perspective, like his manuscript of what he's writing, but also other people who were involved. So you do get different viewpoints on events that go on in the story. I don't know, I just really loved this story. Next up on my list is Kill Creek by Scott Thomas. This was nominated for a Bram Stoker Award for debut novel. And this is about 4 horror authors that are invited to a notoriously haunted house for a live interview. And the 4 horror authors deal with different subgenres in horror. So there's kind of a man who used to write, like, he was really big in the 70s and 80s. There's a woman who writes very subversive horror. There's a character who is known for more middle grade horror. And then someone who is great but hasn't come up with anything for a while and has kind of fallen off the radar. They're in this notoriously haunted house and they have to spend the night. And the way that the house reacts to them, and each person has their own different experience in the house. And the story opens up with one of the horror authors teaching a class about horror as literature, and just this great speech about Gothic fiction and how Gothic fiction is everywhere and it's this formula that we love. And I just loved this story. And if you like horror fiction in any capacity, you need to read Kill Creek by Scott Thomas. The next book on my list is Confessions by Kanae Minato. This is often hailed as the Japanese Gone Girl, but this opens up with a teacher addressing her 8th grade class and letting them know that she is retiring after the tragic death of her toddler-aged daughter who drowned. She is telling her class and letting her know she's going to retire, but then she also drops that her daughter's death was not an accident. She was murdered, and the 2 murderers are in this class. And from there, we get a story of revenge that does not stop and is not afraid to go crazy places. So if you like stories that are fast-paced and do not hold back and are not afraid to go there, you need to read Confessions by Kanae Minato. And the next book I want to talk about is Scream All Night by Derek Milman. I'm actually not sure if this book is available yet. I will leave the information for that in the box down below. This is a YA story that follows Dario Hayward, who is the son of a cult horror filmmaker who makes his movies in a Gothic castle called Moldavia Studios. All his movies are shot there, and the cast and crew actually live on the grounds and in the castle. And as idyllic as that sounds, at least to me because I'm a weirdo, Dario had a lot of issues with his father. He had a very complicated and complex relationship with his family and the movie making industry. And so he actually is emancipated from his parents and resides in a group home. He gets a phone call from his older brother inviting him to a very important event that his father is hosting and that his father really wants him to attend. And so he reluctantly decides to attend this event, but is also really trying to keep clear boundaries and not get sucked back into the world of Moldavia Studios and everything that goes along with that. And this was just such a great coming of age story about dealing with complex relationships. There was a lot of really fun, quirky characters, and as a horror fan, I really enjoyed this. If you're a horror fan, you probably figured out that Dario Hayward is, named after Dario Argento. And just the nods that are done throughout the book are very artfully done. They don't stick out. They're not super crazy. They're subtle enough for horror fans to enjoy, but not enough to detract from anything if you yourself are not a big horror fan. I just thought this was done so well and says so much about family relationships and legacies and defining yourself and making your own way in the world. And this, I loved it so much. The next book I want to talk about is a book that came out very recently, and that is The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay. This is quite the story. It follows a gay couple and their daughter. They're spending, you know, some time at a cabin just relaxing when four strangers force themselves in and share some very strange beliefs. It is a home invasion story. If you're familiar with that genre in horror, this book is very claustrophobic and stressful and anxiety inducing, and it does not stop. You feel like you're stuck in this hot cabin with these characters. I was biting my nails trying to figure out like what was going to happen in this stressful situation. Like, who are these people? What are they capable of? It's And the last book I wanted to talk about was Boy's Life by Robert McCammon, and this was a beautiful coming of age story that takes place in 1950s in a small town in Alabama named Zephyr. A young boy and his father witness a strange murder in their otherwise idyllic town and the consequences that come up from that. And what I loved about it is that really that is a main thread of the story, but there is so much going on. We just get the story of this boy growing up in this town, and it was so like comforting and wonderful. I would say it was very reminiscent of like Big Fish in that it was a beautiful story set in the South and, you know, finding magic in the mundane and about a father-son relationships. And because this does take place in the 1950s in Alabama, there are some story beats about racism, and so of course everything that goes along with the story being set in that era. But I thought this was just so touching. I absolutely cried after reading this and decided that I needed to read everything Robert McCammon has written. So definitely suggest checking that out if you haven't, if that's not on your radar. I see this listed a lot as horror, and if you're not a horror reader, I really wouldn't let that turn you off. Nothing about this was like frightening. I would say there was a little more, I would call it magical realism. Anyway guys, those are my top 10 books that I have read so far this year. Let me know if you have read any of these books, if you have any thoughts or opinions on my thoughts or opinions. Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye.